This is the MixCoach Podcast. On this episode, we're going to be talking to David Stagl from Atlanta, Georgia, about the parallels from front of house mixing and his experience in the studio and how they tie together. So stay tuned. This episode was a lot of fun. I've made a new friend in David Stagl. He's a very accomplished front of house engineer, and he also has a studio that he does quite a bit of work in his studio too. When he's not on the road, he's at home in his studio, and he's one of the guys that I have noticed that a lot of the listeners of this podcast and followers of MixCoach, that's exactly what they do. They usually, work for their band, work in a church, and it's not exclusively studio. And David's going to bring a lot of light to that subject, how you can draw parallels, pluses and minuses of being able to apply what have done in the studio to what you've done live on stage. We're going to talk about the speed of feedback, not the kind of feedback that that's a frequency feedback, but feedback of your work and how quickly you can improve by doing certain things. In the studio, it seems to happen a little slower. On stage, it happens instantly. The second that you don't do something right because you get the evil eye from some of the people in the audience. We're going to talk about that a little bit. I apologize for the fan noises in the background. It's very slight, but only I figured since if this weren't an audio engineering podcast and blog, I wouldn't even mention it, but I know you guys are going to hear that sort of thing, and I apologize for it. I'll hold my mic a little closer next time, okay? I promise. So anyway, so here's the podcast with David Stagl. Hope you like it. Hey, David. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good, man. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for meeting me so early. It's a little early on this side of the continent, but it's a little later on that side of the continent.
It's about lunchtime for me.
It's about breakfast time here. So David, I have been wanting to talk to you because you do some really cool stuff, and you're based in Atlanta. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So tell everybody, tell the people listening here what it is you do.
Well, the main thing I kind of focus on right now is I'm helping churches take their sound to the next level. So helping them improve. A lot of times it's training their engineers, which can be a mix of staff guys and volunteers. Sometimes it's looking at their systems and re-optimizing PAs. It can be just looking at their systems and how they go about, working week to week. So I do a lot of stuff to help that. And then I'm also an audio engineer. I've been an audio engineer professionally now for full time, I guess, for 19 years. So I do a lot of stuff in the studio, do a lot of front of house work, mixing. 2 days ago, I was out of town mixing front of house at a church. And today I'm back in my studio doing audio post-production. So it's all over the map.
Yeah, so cool. So audio post-production, what is that to you defined?
Basically, I'm kind of like mixing audio for videos.
Okay. Well, cool.
So in this case, it's just really talking heads. Today, anyways, it's just talking heads. But sometimes there can be music beds, sound effects. So it can be everything from just basic mixing to doing audio restoration and cleanup work to picking sound effects. I don't usually do a lot of that. Most of my clients have that kind of stuff spotted in, so I'm really just kind of mixing the same way someone would send me tracks for music. It's just it goes with video. Yeah.
So I wanted to get with you today because one of the things that I am doing is I'm shifting what I do a little bit. I'm not just a recording engineer who works in the studio all the time now. I'm kind of branching out and doing kind of the same thing you are, except mainly for one church, and that's a church here in Yorba Linda. And we are, one of the things I'm getting used to is having a volunteer staff of people who I'm, getting used to what that entails for me. I mean, it's something that has always been easy for me to do by myself. Now I have to think, hey, I need to loop some other people in on this sort of thing. Everything from
Yeah.
changing the sound system to changing the workflow. So, and this is kind of an out of the blue question a little bit, but do you have any advice for me as far as how to get used to working with volunteers and things that I can do to help that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's where to start. I think in general, and I can just, because I was on staff at a couple of churches for about 11 years, and I started at, and I guess the first church I was on was pretty big, and we had about 3,000 people coming, and then I was on staff at North Point Community Church outside of Atlanta, which is one of the largest churches in the country, and I was there for 9 years and worked with a lot of volunteers. The biggest revelation I had, I think, early on in the first church job I had was to not try and do everything myself, because there's a lot of things that go on when you get into church world with different events, and everybody has different needs, and there's only so many hours in a week. So the big revelation I had was I can't do this all by myself, and to bring in the other volunteers who were there to really be on a team versus not just, and it's a team. And I think that's something, when I'm working in my studio, I'm used to doing everything kind of myself. When you get into a team, you kind of all have to go at it together. Mm-hmm. So really keeping that in mind. I always try and give ownership to guys as much as possible and make them feel like they're a part of the process. Mm-hmm. So if we're picking equipment or looking at ways of doing things, I want to involve other guys as much as possible, because if people feel like they have ownership, they'll buy into it a lot more. Mm-hmm. And it also helps with consistency and getting everybody kind of on the same page.
Right. And I'm finding that it's really, just like when I started MixCoach, to teach what I do know, maybe it kind of distills why it is I do what I do the way I do it. And I think it's the same way. Like for me running the front of house, I probably only run front of house here at this church about 4 times now, 5 times maybe, and the rest of the time in the last 7 months has been volunteers. So I'm trying to be careful. Okay, so when you teach this to them, make sure that it's something that's duplicatable. That's not even a word. Yeah. that you can duplicate, and that would be an easy win for people when they volunteer to do something. Set them up to win.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm starting to implement things like scenes and snapshots for songs. Is that something that you do when you do live sound?
Yeah, if I'm on it depends on the situation, and a lot of that depends on the band. A lot of the churches will do stuff where you might have one lead singer on one song and a completely different lead singer on the next one. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to have maybe slightly different vocal effects treatment I want to do on the leads versus the backgrounds. So I'm going to have to switch some of that stuff up. Mm-hmm. And I'll use snapshots for that. And I tend to use snapshots as a starting point for a song, and then I'm very hands-on mixing, and I think that's just I think that comes from doing it for a long time. And when I started in audio, we were still all analog, so it was large format consoles and all that fun stuff. Pro Tools was just starting to show up, I think. My junior year of college, or maybe it was my sophomore year, somewhere in there, I got my hands on Pro Tools, and it was, I don't remember what version it was. It was like Pro Tools 24. So, I mean, they were just going 24-bit, if you can.
Okay.
If people can imagine.
I was going to say, Pro Tools is at Pro Tools 12 now, so have you been to the future?
Yeah, I have been to the future.
Okay. So, Dave, you're a good guy to ask this kind of question. I'm trying to find as many parallels as I can for my guys at MixCoach, because mostly what we've taught at MixCoach is studio mixing, because that's they say when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Uh-huh.
So when you have a platform, and when you do what I have done for so many years, you look at everything from a studio, within the studio perspective, and that's what you teach. But I'm finding that a lot of my listeners they do what we do now, and I say we because I'm working in production at a church part time. So, what parallels do you think that we can draw, or mainly you can draw, and I can glean from? What parallels? What things can you learn in the studio that are like very applicable to live sound, and vice versa? What things can you learn from doing live sound that you can apply to the studio that maybe some guys miss, that we can maybe draw some lines between?
Yeah, that is a great question. In terms of parallels, you know, audio is audio. Physics doesn't change going from live sound to the studio or back and forth. One of the things that some of the guys who mentored me in live sound always used to say is you need to learn fundamental mixing skills, and one of the best places to learn that is in the studio, because compressors and learning how to set attack times and release times and and ratios and all that kind of stuff, EQ decisions, none of that changes really going between the studio and live sound. And in some ways, I think it can be better to learn that stuff in a studio environment, because we're typically in a little more controlled environment. When we get into the live sound world, room acoustics become a big issue for us, and some of that kind of stuff, that and the PA choice and the way it's deployed and set up, that will start to color our sound and affect what's coming out of the speakers. So some of that can smear some things around. So you might not hear things quite as good as you would in a studio. Something like, me getting picky with the attack time on a snare drum or something like that to really get some snap and punch out of things.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff. Sometimes the live world can kind of smear that kind of stuff. But if you have a foundation of just great mixing fundamentals, it's a lot easier to kind of zero in on that stuff you're looking to hear and to apply it to the live world. On the live side, I think one of the things that I see affects guys who are coming from a studio background is just how fast everything happens.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading an article or listening to a podcast, and studio guys talking about how do you know when the mix is done? Well, for me, I know the mix is done when the gig is over. When I'm doing live sound, because sooner or later you're going to run out of time, and it that doesn't mean doing live sound you don't still run into that same kind of situation, because there's a certain point where you really kind of want to stop tweaking EQs and compressors and your reverb times and pre-delays and all that kind of fun stuff, and you really just have to sit down and mix and push faders and just make it this musical presentation that's emotional and connects with the audience. I think that immediacy that happens in live sound is a different thing from in the studio. The studio, I like going in the studio because I can spend 3 hours automating and tweaking and really fine-tuning and refining things. It's probably to my detriment. Versus when I go and I'm doing something live, it's, we'll get maybe in the church world, usually you can get a rehearsal and a sound check kind of run together, and you can get a couple of runs at a song, and then we do it, and you run it down, and when it's done, it's done.
So what I'm hearing you say, and I can attest to this, I teach on MixCoach that the best thing that can happen in your mix is to move someone to action. If you can, let's just say you're mixing some kind of pop music, and you can mix it in such a way that people want to, start off by bobbing their head, maybe a little bit, maybe snapping their fingers, clapping their hands, or whatever. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate win in the studios, except for, covering their ears. So you don't really want that too much when you're mixing. But but the feedback loop, it seems to be a lot faster when you're mixing live because, in the studio, you have to print it and then you have to deal with all those voices in your head that say, have you really spent enough time on this vocal? I mean, I know it was good, but, a real engineer would spend a lot more time. I mean, I've read all these magazine articles that say that you spend a lot of time on vocals, and you really don't have a way to say, yes, that was the right move until someone hears your mix. And like on MixCoach, we listen to guys' mixes on MixCoach Member, and we give them feedback. But that feedback loop almost takes a month almost, because from the time they get the song till the time they hear the feedback, it's a month. In live music, you can tell if you're making people, if you're moving people to action immediately, almost immediately. Like if there's a big part of a song that has a bass drop or something like that, and you push it to the subs a little bit harder, and you make the room shake, and you can feel what you've done. To me, that feedback loop is almost instant. I mean, would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It all happens right away. Yeah. And one of the things I do a lot of times when I'm mixing is, I'm trying to watch what's going on stage, because I need to make sure that, because what we see influences what we hear. And there's all kinds of cool YouTube videos on things like the McGurk effect, if you really want to go and explore that kind of stuff. But also I'm watching the audience and the people who are there listening, and to see how they're reacting. Are they running for the doors because it's too loud, or are they bobbing their heads and getting into it?
Yeah.
And that's part of the thing I like about the live sound thing too, is it's kind of like you get instant gratification in a way on how you're doing sometimes. But it's also, I'm typically, it's really rare. I almost can't even think of one time where I'm really just mixing just for me. I'm always getting feedback from the client, which, maybe it's a senior pastor or a music director or a producer, the artist. Sometimes now in the live world, we've got this thing called virtual sound check a lot of times, where we can actually record rehearsals or events or shows or services, and then basically we multi-track them, and then we can flip the console over into virtual sound check and basically play the whole thing back, which is great for me, coming from the studio, because it just gives me more time, so I can really refine some stuff. But the other thing it does is it allows the band to walk off the stage, and one of the things a lot of live sound guys aren't used to is having the band actually be able to come out and listen to what you're doing. If you're in the studio, you get used to it, because you got there's the client couch in the back, and they're all sitting there. Well, there's no client couch, or there didn't used to be a client couch in the live world, but we've got one now a lot of times. So, people are coming in and they're giving feedback. The hardest mixes for me to do most of the time are when I'm just trying to mix demo material in my studio, or I might mess around with a mixing contest if I've got a day free or something. That stuff is way harder for me to do than when I'm actually either doing live sound out for somebody or mixing my studio for a client, because I'm really dependent on getting feedback and people telling me where I'm at.
Yeah, that's cool. I have so many, you touched on so many things out there I want to follow up on. One, maybe I may be embarrassed after asking this. I have heard briefly of the McGurk effect. Did I say that right? What is that exactly?
Basically, what we see will inform what we hear.
Okay.
So there's a couple of demonstrations I've seen with it. One is where, there's certain consonants like P's and B's where you can, depending on what the audio is, it can make you, or what you're seeing can make you start to hear consonants.
Right.
The demonstration I really like, and I think this is still McGurk effect, I could be wrong, but there was a thing that I think Poppy Crumb did at AES several years ago, and she used the old Led Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven backwards masking kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And she plays Stairway backwards, which to me just sounds like gibberish.
Yeah.
I don't hear any of that stuff.
Right.
But then she puts up the text for what people think it says.
Oh.
And as soon as you can read the text and hear the words with it, you hear it clear as day.
Wow.
So for me, when I'm mixing in churches, where one of the areas that this comes into play is a lot of times we've got these big screens in there where we put song lyrics up, because one of the things that's different about music in church from, say, a concert situation is we're really trying to get everybody in the room to participate and sing along. And since not everybody goes home and listens to all the songs we're going to do, you put the words on the screen so people can sing along. And when you can read the words, it affects how well people can hear the vocals.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I can cheat vocals a little lower in the room,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that the words are on the screen. So if I'm struggling a little bit on a certain week to get a vocal loud enough, if I know I've got words on the screen, I might not worry about it as much.
So
until the words, the guy doing the lyrics messes up, and now
right.
now
So
I'm
what
back
you're
there.
saying then is, if you can't hear the vocal, you just turn the brightness on the screen up, and that fixes everything.
Contrast, actually. It's the
Yeah,
contrast.
that's cool, man.
Well, and the other thing too is, I think when you look at a stage and you see, a drummer wailing away on drums, or there's a kid up there and he's windmilling on a guitar, there's an expectation that you want to hear something. And
Right.
if people can't look up on the stage and hear what they see, I think it's kind of a disconnect. And now people start, there's something that's not quite natural about it. There was a quote I like to kind of steal from producer Chuck Plotkin, where he says, people, they don't need to hear every word in the song. They just need to feel like they could if they wanted to. And that's kind of the way I look at it. It's like, you don't have to necessarily, I'm not necessarily looking for individual distinction in an instrument, but it needs to feel like if somebody looks up on stage and sees something happening, they need to hear it. And
Right.
I'll go into churches and there's 9 people on stage and it sounds like there's only one person singing. That's kind of strange to me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or I'll see that on TV or on a webcast or, something like that. So our eyes they play into what we're hearing. It's a very different thing from when I'm in my studio and I've just got audio coming out of the speakers, and you kind of want to, well, actually, you know what? You hear a lot of guys talk about in the studio about how they don't, that like turn your monitor off, don't watch the waveforms,
Right.
don't watch the faders moving, because
Mm-hmm.
that makes you hear things a little different. It's
Right.
the same kind of thing. It's all
Yeah.
part of that, I think. So
Interesting.
close your eyes and listen.
Yeah, I am very familiar with the McGurk effect, because I know when I mix audio for video, like especially live concerts, it's easy to get the vocal too loud. For me, the vocal a little bit too loud over that threshold of like commercial sound. If you can see the video, I always mix the vocal just a little bit lower, especially if that vocalist is on the screen. So I didn't realize that was called the McGurk effect. So
I think it's the McGurk effect. I could be completely off on that. It's called something, I'll tell you that.
It's gonna. Well, there will be a big, huge disclaimer if it's not called the McGurk effect. Okay. Hey, let's see. So just a couple more things here. My job here at this church here in Yorba Linda is going to be transitioning them from a small sanctuary with a kind of a smaller team of volunteers to quite a large sanctuary as compared to what I'm used to, and that's it's going to be 1,000 to 1,200 seat sanctuary, and so we're going with a company that you're familiar with, because I've heard you on a podcast with some of the guys, CCI Solutions, and I think I've heard several podcasts with you on. It's called Church Tech Weekly, right?
Yeah.
There's some guys on there that, I totally trust their opinions. But some of those guys are using brands of microphones that I'm not totally familiar with. And I was going to run a few of those by you. One is Heil. I mean, I had never really considered seriously using Heil because I always thought about Heil as being, that's the podcaster's kind of microphone. And now I looked at a YouTube shootout with a bunch of snare mics, and to me the Heil, I think it was a PR22, it was hands down better than a 57. So are there any other, you're kind of shaking your head like you don't know if you agree with that or not.
For me, and I got in a discussion with these because those guys were giving me a hard time because I'm still a 57 on a snare, and I just said, look, if a 57 is good enough for Elliot Shiner, it's good enough for me. And that's just, part of the thing, and this is one of the things in audio too, a lot of it comes into taste, and some of the choices that I might make on equipment are very personal. It doesn't mean what I'm always using is the best, and it doesn't mean it's the worst. Sometimes things aren't better or worse. Sometimes they're just different. And when it comes to a snare drum, I think I would carry a 57 with me everywhere if it wasn't so ubiquitous. With the Heil, I tried I think it was a PR22 or PR21 because a buddy of mine had put one on a snare drum, and I was like, ooh, it has this top end thing on it that I felt like I wasn't necessarily getting, and I tried it, but it didn't have the oomph. And I think part of it comes down to, mic placement. Again, a fundamental studio technique that doesn't necessarily change when we get into live sound. In live sound, we have to put microphones sometimes in places we wouldn't in the studio because we're trying to increase our signal to noise, and there can be a lot of noise on the stage in the form of other instruments and PA bleed, and depending on the scenario, it could be audience, not usually in the church world, but I have heard recordings from guys where the vocal mic, there's almost as much audience of screaming girls in it as the guy trying to sing. But I think with something like some of those different mics, I would need to take a different approach to my mic placement to get the results I want. And in live sound, you don't always have the time to run back and forth between front of house and the stage, moving microphones around. Right. So I just went with that. But, right now I'm talking on a Heil PR31. So...
Well, hey, the reason I even started asking about different snare mics is because, I'm like you. I was raised to believe in 57s on the snare mic. To me, that's
as everybody should be.
Well, they sound awesome. I don't even like multiple snares on the top, and I don't like an under snare mic. I'm very old school when it comes to that. But here's the problem I was running into. In this small sanctuary that we're working in, it's surrounded by this plexiglass cage, and it seems like there is as much kick and hi-hat in my snare mic as there is snare. So I was looking for a snare mic that was more a tighter pattern. And someone told me, and a guy that's on the podcast that you're on a lot, Andrew Stone, mentioned it, and the sound he gets is really cool. So I thought, hey, I think I may try that. So I ended up buying it, and it hasn't come in yet. But are there any workarounds for that sort of thing? Is it the cage that's causing so much leakage?
Well, yeah. There's a strange thing when we put plexiglass around drums. We're introducing a lot of reflections because we've got this hard plastic surface, and then there could be reflections from whatever's behind the drums and what are they sitting on. One of the big things that I notice with drummers, especially in the church world, is they're not always as seasoned or experienced as some of the guys I would work with in the studio. Some of them I've worked with in the church. I've worked with drummers who were, former major label band drummers and who've toured and done a lot of that. But with the lesser experienced drummers, what they're not always as good at doing is kind of playing what I would call a kit mix, where basically they're just kind of balancing all of their instrumentation the way they're playing. So sometimes you might have things out of proportion in the way they're hitting the drums. Like I notice a lot of drummers who are not as experienced, they might not be playing rim shots on 2 and 4 on a snare drum like I'm used to on the backbeat of a rock tune. So they might be laying back a little too much in a verse where I might want them to hit a little harder. They might be laying on the kick drum really hard. The bigger place where I usually run into issues is guys just overplaying their cymbals. Because the other thing that happens too is when people put in in-ear monitors, which is what most people I see these days are using, when you stick something in your monitors, it's not a or when you stick something in your ears, it's not a natural way to hear. We're just not, I don't think we were made to put headphones on. So it changes, and what does that do? You put something in your ears, it muffles all the top end. So guys sit there and they wail on the cymbals a little harder because cymbals are all high frequency.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe what I need to do then on the Avion mix, or the mix that's going to the drummer, maybe I need to pump a little overhead in there just so he can hear a lot of cymbals, and maybe he'll dial it back just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and this is another thing that kind of parallels studio side to live side. What a musician is hearing is going to influence how they play. So when I start running into problems in live sound, one of the first things I look at is their monitor mix. If you have a vocalist who's not pushing hard enough and they're not pushing enough air, they're going to have pitch problems. Well, sometimes with in-ear monitors, what they'll do is they'll turn themselves up too loud to themselves. So now they're not singing at that kind of optimum volume for themselves, and they're going flat because their monitors are just too loud. You turn them down a few dB, and they'll naturally just start pushing a little more.
So nothing different there. I mean, what they hear and how they play. The thing sometimes it's hard, even after years of experience, sometimes it's hard to trace it down to the core source of good sound. And the thing I'm trying to instill into my team is that good sound, and I think you just said it, good sound starts on the stage. You've got to have,
absolutely,
you got to have the musician who knows that the hi-hat is not the snare, and you've got to hit the snare harder than the hi-hat if you want it to sound right. You've got to have good instruments, good players that play good parts, and then our job becomes instantly a lot easier. So So I've even heard of churches. Some churches, Church on the Move, I think, they even buy good instruments and say these are the only instruments that we're going to play here on the stage. I mean, have you run into any other churches where the churches own the instruments and say, these are great instruments, you play them this way? Or
I think, and I have some mixed feelings on some of that because I'm a guitar player too. Usually what I see is in churches is there's usually a house drum kit and, usually house keyboards too, like the bigger stuff. Sometimes there might be amplifiers, or I see a lot of kind of amp simulators. Now I'm starting to run into, for a while it was pods. Now I'm running into, oh my gosh, I can't, like the Kempers.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to see some of those around, and then sometimes it's amplifiers. And, sometimes that works. I kind of come from the school where tone is in the hands.
Yeah.
So with a drummer, the tone on the drum is all about how they strike that drum and how fast they get the stick off the head. I was just watching an interview with Kenny Aronoff not too long ago where he was talking about how he was trained to pull his stick up off the head. And I've had, say, 3 different drummers on the same kit in a church, and it's 3 different sounds. Now, it's not night and day. I don't think there's, the tone and the note of the drum, that's going to kind of stay the same as long as the tuning doesn't go out of whack. But there's just so much more involved to drums, just in how someone's hitting the kick. Are they burying the beater in the head? Are they just tapping it? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to play that. So sometimes I think churches approach, they think, oh, we'll just get good instruments and good equipment and that'll solve anything, or it'll solve everything. But it doesn't work like that. It's the same thing we face in the studio where people go, oh, if I have, X, Y, and Z plugins, I'm going to mix just like, the A-list guys. And you and I both know that it doesn't work like that because everything music and audio, it's all an interpretation at the end of the day. So you kind of got to get your tastes right and work on your fundamentals and your skills first, and then you can start making stuff good. Right. But the place for me with everything is it always starts at the source. If it's not right at the source, it's just gonna compound in challenges down the line.
Okay, so let me ask this kind of a last question then, and this is one of those things that I think it just takes years of experience. Which you and I both have a lot of experience working with musicians. I worked in Nashville for 20 years, and then before that worked with
that's like cheating.
It almost is. And then before that, I worked with some phenomenal musicians in North Carolina who really knew how to put parts together and make a record sound good. So our job now, which my job now is like I'm working with musicians who one of our best musicians, they're barely driving a car, and so they don't have a ton of experience. And then you've got other guys, who just kind of they pretty much just play on Sundays. So, which is the case really for a lot of studio owners. They don't get to record the best of the best like we've gotten to. I know that one of my favorite drummers is I think one of the guys you said is one of your favorite drummers, and that's Scott Meter. I mean, we get to work with he's awesome, and he can take a bad sounding set of drums and make it sound good. So I guess my question is this: since most of the guys who do front of house and who maybe have a studio, that's in a suburban area or maybe that's not Nashville, Atlanta, L.A., New York, etc. How do you work that fine line of knowing that you've got your end set up, that the signal path is good? How do you talk to a drummer or a guitar player and say, hey, if you could just do it this way without stepping on their toes and without making them feel belittled somehow because somebody's telling them how to do their job, how do you navigate that?
Well, I think with anything, when you're trying to influence something, it comes down to trust, and people need to trust you before they're really going to start to taking your opinion. So I try and get to know guys when I'm working with them, and it doesn't have to, we don't have to go out to coffee and have lunch, although that's not a bad idea. But the reality is a lot of times that just doesn't work. Typically when I'm working with a band, I usually have some interaction with at least one person, or I've had some interaction previously with one person who I might channel some stuff through. If I'm working with a band and I know their music director, but I'm maybe not as familiar with the drums, I'll go talk to the music director and say, hey, here's what I'm hearing. And you want to try and be as encouraging as you can in things, because nobody likes getting bad feedback and negative feedback. And a lot of times too, is for me is because I kind of come from, and maybe it's just from starting as an intern and then being a recording engineer. Part of my school of thought as an engineer is I kind of need to shut up a lot of the time. So it's hard to kind of find that balance with where do you interject and where do you just kind of stand back, because it's not my project, it's not my music, it's really somebody else's. I want to help them, get their art out to people.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a fine line. I don't know if that really answers it, but for me, I guess at the end of the day it's just trust. And a lot of times, I had one of my really, really good friends was a drummer in my band years ago, and he and I would sit around, and he was just drum geek extraordinaire. He could sit around and talk about, what is this type of wood over this type of metal and all these kinds of things do to the sound. And I don't necessarily remember all of that conversation, but I know enough about drums to be very, very dangerous. And I can have a conversation with a drummer about his equipment. So if someone walks in and they bring in a Superphonic, I can go, hey, that's a Ludwig Superphonic, right? Oh, I love those. And if you have something like that, you can go somewhere with guitar players, because I'm a guitar player. I'll look at their guitars and I'm like, oh, what is this? So I can tell it's a Strat neck and it's a Tele body, and then they'll start talking about that. It's like, but I really like the Bigsby. You got a big, you put a Bigsby on anything and it just makes everything look cool. That kind of stuff. When you can start talking to guys like that, it starts gaining trust. One of the hard things I think in live sound is sometimes there is this wall that has been built up between the musicians and the audio guys, the front of house guys, and the backline guys, and that, because they played in a club somewhere where it was obvious that the front of house guy didn't care and he was just there and didn't want to be. And musicians, sometimes they come into situations and they have this baggage there, and it's not your fault as an engineer if someone comes in with that, but it's something you have to deal with, and you can't really fault them because they had a bad experience somewhere. So for me, it's all about trying to get them to trust me and to have them understand that I am going to do everything I possibly can to make them sound the best they can, maybe even better than they possibly can. And when guys understand that, they're very, very much more open to suggestions and ideas and things from me. I had a thing just this last weekend at the church I was at, where I had suggested the drummer was playing halftime in a break between a chorus and a verse, and it was maybe 2 bars, if that, 2 bars, 4 bars, something like that. And I just suggested to the lead singer, I was like, and he came out and we were listening to the playback in between, and I was like, hey, I wonder if this would be better if he played it straight and didn't do the halftime. And I gave him the headphones and played him back the board mix from that, and he listened to it and he went, yeah, you're right. I think you're right. We'll try that next time.
So just to distill everything you said, I've been sitting here thinking, wheels are spinning. So you're kind of saying in a nutshell that musicians don't really mind your feedback as long as they know you've got their back.
Yeah.
Would that be good?
Yeah, most of them do. I mean, there's some. Yeah. I mean, there's some artists who they know what they want. I was listening to someone on a podcast who had worked with Prince, and I mean, that's I don't know how I would work if I had been able to work with him. I don't know how that would have gone. But everybody's different, and a lot of times it's just figuring out how do you build a bridge. Build bridges, not walls.
Yeah, that's cool, man. That's some good stuff. I appreciate your feedback and your insight from your years of experience, and I appreciate you drawing those lines between sound is sound, and a good mix is a good mix. And in some ways, the church mix is a little bit more challenging because you don't get to handpick everyone who plays. You don't necessarily get to handpick the musicians. You definitely probably didn't get to design the room and pick the console. So really, your years of experience in the studio where you did have control over that. It's kind of like aligning a tape machine a little bit. I don't know if you're from that old school.
I don't ever want to align a tape machine again.
Well, I mean, when you align a tape machine, as you know, you have to kind of know where you stand, and that's why you have the test tape to show you what is right, so that you can correct what's not necessarily right. And
yeah,
I think
I got a bunch of 2-inch reels sitting in my closet. I don't ever want to use them again.
I think they need to come out with a cologne that smells like 2-inch tape rewinding. I love it. I love the smell of it. I love the sound of it. But anyway, kind of miss it. But I'm not looking back, because the things that we can do these days with virtual sound checks and plugins is just amazing. So, hey Dave, thank you for hanging out with me for a little while.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been fun. Maybe we can do this again soon and solve some more of the world's problems. You think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love solving problems.
So how can my guys get in touch with you?
There's a couple of ways. On Twitter, my username is FOHDave, and then I have a website, and I write articles up there on basically my journey, and some of them come across, I guess, tutorial-ish to some guys. Mm-hmm. And maybe, I guess I do write some of them that way, but it's really just, it's been my journey for the last, 11, 12 years. There's like 11 years of stuff on there, so you can go back to when, it was questionable whether I really knew what I was doing, because we all start there, but the website for that is goingto11.com, and it's 11 the number, so goingto11.com.
So it's not going toll?
No, but it might look like
it might look like going toll.
Font.
That's awesome. Going to 11. That's not influenced by the what was the movie that was from?
Spinal Tap? No, not at all.
No.
Not at all.
You had all your amps modified, right?
Yeah, all the Digico, which is a live sound console, I think a lot of their knobs go to 11.
Oh, really? So, that's awesome. Man, this has been fun. Thank you for hanging out. And
my pleasure.
I look forward to the next time.
Definitely. Thanks, Kevin.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks, Dave. Again, if you want to reach out to Dave, his blog is goingto11.com, and that's the number 11, so it looks like going toll. But it's not. It's goingto11.com. Read some of the stuff he's got up there. It's really cool. I've been reading some too. If you want to reach out on Twitter or on Instagram, it's FOH as in front of house, FOH Dave, and that will get you in touch with him. If you want some of the experience that we're talking about in the studio of mixing, we said mixing is mixing. If you want some of those files to download, check out MixCoach Member. MixCoach, we have we cover a different style of music every month, and we give our listeners a chance to submit their songs for feedback. We give you a tutorial. Sometimes we give you an interview. Sometimes we give you a walkthrough, a Bones video. All that's lingo that we use, but suffice it to say, there's plenty of training on MixCoachMember.com. So come check us out, okay? Thanks for tuning in to the podcast. It's been a pleasure. And if you have any questions for the podcast, go to mixcoach.com/questions, and we'll get your questions on the podcast, okay? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.